The controversial reference to Japan's Pearl Harbor attack during World War II stirring sensitivities as Prime Minister Sanae Takaichi meets President Trump in the Oval Office, and he draws parallels with U.S. strikes on Iran.
When we go in, we went in very hard, and we didn't tell anybody about it because we wanted surprise. Who knows better about surprise than Japan? Okay? Why didn't you tell me about Pearl Harbor? Okay? Right?
Well, joining us is Glen S Fukushima, visiting fellow at Stanford University. Mr. Fukushima, thank you very much for joining us. So, on the surface, the meeting seemed very warm, but let's get your thoughts on that awkward moment right there. What does that tell us about the underlying tension in this alliance right now?
Well, overall, I think the meetings went well. There was a 30-minute public meeting, and after that, 1.5 hours of a private meeting. The public meeting, I think, went better than many had thought because there was real concern, especially in Japan, that the president would bring up the issue of Japanese sending military support for the Strait of Hormuz. That didn't really come up, and therefore, the Prime Minister Takaichi was able to focus on the importance of the U.S.-Japan alliance and also importance of economic security and the cooperation between the two countries. So I think that with the exception of that somewhat awkward moment of the president referring to Pearl Harbor, overall, I think that the meetings went as well as could be expected from the Japanese side.
And can you just give us your assessment of her performance in Washington, Ms. Takaichi's performance specifically, holding the line against Trump's push for military involvement? And then there was that joint statement with the European powers calling for securing the Strait of Hormuz without clear combat commitments. Was it skillful diplomacy on her part, or expectations now perhaps that Japan will eventually have to do more?
Well, you know, for these summit meetings, there's a tremendous amount of preparation done in advance. And I saw during the 3-4 weeks leading up to the meeting, there were just constant meetings taking place between the Japanese and U.S. governments. And so I expected that since both sides wanted to have a successful meeting, that there would not be any visible conflicts. And in the public meeting of 30 minutes, the president praised Prime Minister Takaichi as a popular and powerful woman based on the election results, an overwhelming landslide victory that the LDP had. And Prime Minister Takaichi praised President Trump as the only person. She said, "Donald, you're the only person who can ensure peace and prosperity around the world." And so, you know, the tensions were really kind of under the surface. They really didn't come up publicly. And the president also went so far as to say that Japan, you're different from NATO. And so they gave a signal that the president thinks that Japan is doing more. And then he also said, I'm expecting Japan to step up. So we don't yet have a report readout of what happened during the 90-minute meeting, the private meeting. But after that meeting, although the U.S. did not have there was no joint press conference, as is usually the case between the president and prime minister, but the Japanese Prime Minister Takaichi did have a press conference in Japanese, specifically for the Japanese media. And in that, she emphasized the cooperation and the emphasis of Japan-U.S. alliance. And so I think the Japanese spin on it is that everything went well. We don't yet have the readout from the U.S. side, so it's a little premature to assess overall how, and from the U.S. perspective. From the Japanese perspective, it went quite well.
Okay, so what do you think she's realistically offered Mr. Trump behind closed doors?
Well, the focus of the meeting from the Japanese point of view is twofold. One is to reconfirm the U.S.-Japan security alliance, especially because the thought was that the president would be going to China. And so the initial impetus, the request from the Japanese side was, let us have a meeting before you go to China, because we want to make sure that you understand Japan's position, especially since the November 7th statement by the prime minister in the parliament in Japan, which evoked a great deal of opposition by China, her statement about Taiwan. So the first point was to reaffirm the U.S.-Japan alliance and make sure that China understands that the U.S. and Japan are in lockstep cooperation. And that, I think, was achieved. The second thing that Takaichi wanted to do was to focus on the economic cooperation and the economic security ties between the U.S. and Japan, especially involving the $550 billion investment agreement that was reached last year. So those were the two things, and I think they accomplished those two things that the Japanese had wanted to do. The additional, February 8th invasion by the United States and Israel on Iran kind of threw a wrench into the Japanese plans because that had not been anticipated. And there were concerns that because the president had made some comments about and had listed Japan among many of the countries that he thought should work to clear the Strait of Hormuz, there was a real concern that that would come up. But I think there was, as I mentioned, a lot of preparation done in advance to shorten the public meeting before the cameras, and also not to have a joint press conference afterwards. I think the Japanese side tried very hard and were successful in minimizing the risks and containing any differences to the private meeting, the content of which has not yet been made public.
And Mr. Fukushima, you brought up Ms. Takaichi's previous tensions with Beijing. Does her push this time around to steer Washington back toward the Indo-Pacific reinforce deterrence against China, or risk exposing cracks in the alliance that Beijing could actually exploit?
Well, the president did mention in the public discussion that he expects to praise Japan when he visits Beijing. So that was a word of some comfort to the Japanese side. So the outward appearance right now is that the U.S.-Japan alliance remains firm, and there is no public indication of any rupture between the U.S. and Japan. So from the Japanese point of view, I think they accomplished what they wanted. What went on in the 90-minute private meeting, we don't know for sure yet. But overall, I think that from the standpoint of both the U.S. and Japan, they very much wanted to make sure this was a successful meeting because both sides will be able to benefit, not only in terms of the U.S.-Japan relationship, but domestically. I think that President Trump wants to demonstrate, especially with the midterms coming up, that he's able to manage relationships with our allies, and especially because of some of the tensions between the United States and European allies, including the NATO countries. Also, Japan and Prime Minister Takaichi very much want to demonstrate to the Japanese public that she's able to handle the United States and handle President Trump, despite his somewhat unpredictable statements and actions. And so both sides actually wanted to reassure their own domestic constituents that they have a good relationship. And, one of the big symbols the Japanese kept repeating in their press, in their TV coverage is the fact that when the prime minister arrived at the White House, the president hugged the prime minister. And so they started with this very intimate hug, and then they went in and for the public 30-minute period, he was very cordial, very diplomatic, and very soft on the prime minister. Didn't really ask her or demand any tough any questions, and the prime minister went out of her way to really try to praise the president as well. So at least on the outward public performance, both sides were on their best behavior. And as I say, the domestic audience was key for both of them.
And I might add, they're in Washington, D.C. for sort of a state banquet right now. 2 pecks on the cheeks. I just saw that, too. All right. Thank you so much for your insight, Glen S Fukushima, visiting fellow at Stanford University, for speaking with us.